Hello and welcome back, folks. It's always a pleasure to welcome a new talent into the Splashy Paint studio. Let's sit back and enjoy part one of today's Try Your Hand at project with SAA professional artist Mike Skidmore, as he demonstrates how to get to grips with painting portraits in oils.
Hi, today I'm going to be painting oils in colour on top of this grey tone painting that you may well have seen me produce in an earlier show. Now, what I want to do to begin with is just to talk you through the colours that I'm using and the imagery that I'm working from. In the first place, the imagery is on my laptop. I can thoroughly recommend using a laptop for your picture for the simple reason that you can go in and you can go out for detail or for distance. And a neat little trick I've discovered that if I angle the top forward or backwards, I get different tones of the picture. It looks slightly darker or slightly lighter. So that's really handy when I'm looking to take a picture and do more with it than simply produce a picture on the screen. In terms of the paints I've mixed up a flesh mix and I've mixed up variations on that. My basic flesh mix is flesh tint straight out of a tube. Great thing to do for the simple reason that it allows you to always gauge the amount of other colours you want to add to it to make the colour you want, rather than doing that stuff that is so often done. We want a bit of flesh, we put a bit of red, we put a bit of yellow, we put a bit of white into it, put too much yellow, so we put some more red. Now we've put too much red into it, too much red, we add a bit more white, and we wanted a little bit and we ended up with that much on the palette. Whereas if we use our flesh tone straight from a tube, we can just add other colours to it to make it into the colour we want, and it's much more controllable. So in mine I've got flesh tint, I've got raw umber, I've got cadmium red, and I've got white, and that's it. That makes my flesh tint. And it's the raw umber that makes it look slightly dirty and therefore much more real than the plasticiness that you can get from the original colours. I've then added a series of amounts of white to give me a nice spread of lighter, darker, darker, and even darker that I'm going to use on the picture at various points to make the painting. And I've also got here a bit of medium which I'm going to be using, and that's simply made from a varnish, from linseed oil, and from turpentine. So I'm going to begin with a bit of medium and some darker tone. I don't want this to be too dark and I don't want it to be too light, so the best way to deal with that is to keep it quite thin. I need to find my specs and I'm up and away. Okay, I'm just going to do the darker areas to begin with, and because I've got a lot of work on here already showing the tone, I don't want to obliterate it. I want to let it come through the lighter areas and the darker areas, come through the paint that I'm putting on. And I'm literally just dabbing it on there. I'm not trying to build the paint up in any shape or form. I'm just trying to keep it nice and even and effectively just to tint what's underneath. Now, because this has got some white in it, it still allows me to add colour because the white will knock back some of what's underneath. So we could call this effectively a glaze. However, if we want to get technical about it, because it's got some white in it and because it's taking out a little bit of what's underneath, we would call it a velatura. And a glaze is something we use when we want much more transparency. Now I'm just going to dab in a few of these areas, and I'm going to use the same dark flesh into the darker areas of the main bit. You'll notice that I'm quite happy for the paint to go through the whites of the eye. That's because when I do put the highlights in, the whites of the eye will will effectively look round because I leave the darker tone that I've just put over the top around the edges. Okay, a little bit more there. And of course, if you've done all the hard work in the grey tone, if you've got the picture accurate, if you've explored the lights and the darks so that you feel that you're in control of the picture and it's not in control of you, then when you get to the bit where you put the colour on, it's kind of like the grand finale. You can really enjoy it without having to worry too much about structure, because that's all been taken care of. Now, I'm going to put the same colour onto the lips. I will change the lip colour later, but I like to have a base of the same flesh colour on there because it helps me to build up the paint and keep it looking like the lips are part of the face as opposed to stuck onto the face afterwards. Right, I'm going to move now to a slightly lighter tone. And I haven't got any medium in this because I don't want this to be quite so transparent. But I can see the areas I want it to go because they're already there in the grey tone. And one of the other advantages of doing it like this and having the grey tone is you can leave some of the grey to show through. And actually, if you think about flesh, it's not pink, it's not all clean and colourful. We have pores, we have these, I'll take my glasses off for this one, we have these dark rings under our eyes, which are often bluey grey in colour. We have veins, we have all sorts of different things happening on our face other than that kind of classic colour of skin. And therefore using the grey tone allows us to let some of this show through, and it keeps the skin looking much more realistic. Now again, I'm just working this in to the kind of what I call the medium tone areas of the painting. And making sure that I cover up all of the areas that I need to just knock back a bit. There we go. I've got a little bit around the cheek there. And that will do to begin with for my area of medium tone. What I'm now going to do is I'm just going to give my brush a little clean, something I do quite often, you can see. And I'm going to grab a little bit of raw umber and a little bit of Payne's grey. Grab a little touch of medium in there, and I'm going to add this now to the rest of the hair. And again, I'm not going to be too fussy about my brush strokes because a lot of the work and the information has been done for me underneath. And it's a good time now to do this because I've now established, by doing the hair, the darkest bit on the picture against which I can reference the other things I do. I'll put a little bit into the eyebrows there. Just like that, and that gives us a sense of depth. Now, I'm going to go to a much smaller brush and I'm just going to add a few marks around the eyes. I've got the same mix of raw umber and Payne's grey. take that into the corner like that. We'll add a little bit more into the eye. Now we need to start building up a bit of strength in those eyes so that when I put the colour into them, they've got something to work against. There we go. Okay, I'm now going to add a little bit of red into that mix. And I'm just going to put the mouth line in. There's the mouth line, and that's ready for me to apply colour to the lips a bit later on. And inside the nostrils, I'm going to use the same red mix. Really important, because when you actually look into somebody's nostrils, not that I'd advise you to do a lot of that, but you can see the kind of red blood vessels that influence the colour. And if you just put a dark colour straight into that, it will look like there's two holes straight through the head. So a bit of red into that, and then a bit of darker colour right in the middle. There you go, that's good. And that will do for now. If you join me later on in the programme, I'll continue working on this and I'll start to add more of the highlights so you can see that flesh start to come to life.
Great approach there, Mike, and we look forward to seeing part 2 later on in today's programme. Now it's time to rummage around the SAA library once more as we look at the must-have books for your collection with the resident bookworm, Henry Moult. Today's book is Atmospheric Watercolours by Gene Haynes. Henry, tell us a bit about the book.
It's a hymn, really, to that, what I think is of as watercolour's best trick, which is wet in wet.
Yeah.
But taken about as far, I think, as you could ever get it to go. If anyone's ever done anything looser, I would really rather like to see it. If you can find page 73 there, Matthew, we can look at a picture which could be anything until I tell you that the title is All That Jazz, and then you can see that it's a jazz musician.
That makes the picture, because on first thought, it's one of those things that you look at and you see different things, which loose watercolour is, and of course wet into wet adds to that, but the title makes it.
Yes,
So
and
it's
if you think about it, that's a jazz musician in the heat of improvisation, and that's in the heat of improvising with watercolour. I don't think you could plan a painting like that. I think you've got to let it happen and come out.
I think that's the thing about loose watercolour, is that it's probably one of the most difficult ways of working because there's no structure to it. Yeah. People who do loose painting is probably one of the hardest and cleverest things to do, to be fair. So is this a book that you just read to give advice on how this particular artist produced that picture, or is it something that you could follow and say, well, this is how to do it, I will have a go at it myself?
It's actually a bit of both. I mean, I'm never sure that you should emulate an artist who has a really individualistic style.
Yeah, it's too hard to do that, definitely.
And, well, you're copying them. But on the other hand, if you wanted to learn to paint loose watercolours, which in a way you'd say, well, you can't because either you have it in you or you don't, that has, as well as a lot of examples and explanations, there are also exercises and demonstrations that will show you how to get from a blank paper to a finished result. Yeah.
From my experience, people who I teach and do classes and things for, they always seem to want to paint looser than they work, but I always say it's whatever you paint is what your style is, and don't try and change it. for me, this kind of book is like it's an advice on how a particular tip was done or a trick and a technique as well. But if you like this kind of painting, it's nice to try and work with the picture that you see, but I think you'd struggle to do it.
I rather like those breakout boxes with tips in them that
They are quite
art
nice,
books have been doing more and more. And it's come from magazine design.
Yeah.
But it gives you just little ideas. I mean, if you actually sat down and read that from cover to cover, it's almost not the point.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty in it to read, and there's a lot of useful information.
Right.
But again, if you sit down and say, I'm going to learn how to do watercolor, it's a bit like saying, I'm going to learn how to play improvised jazz.
Yeah.
It's either in your fingers or it isn't.
Right. So if you was to summarize this book,
In the
what would you
immortal
say?
words of Malcolm McLaren, that's thinking with your hips and not with your head.
I think that's a cracking way to finish. Thanks again for that, Henry. We'll see you next time. Well, it's time for a quick break now, folks, but join us in part 3 when we get interactive with SAA professional artist Bob Hughes and Warren Seeley explains the secrets that lurk in the shadows. I'll see you very soon.